Hey there, today I want to talk to you about fondant survival. I know fondant can be a little bit scary for some people and some things can go wrong. I think though if you have a few tips that can set you on the right track, it's a really rewarding medium to work with. Over the years I've made hundreds of wedding cakes and lots of birthday cakes, a lot of them out of fondant, and I can tell you that I've made a lot of mistakes with it, a lot of things that I've learned that can go right, that cannot go right. So let me give you a few tips for you to get started with, and hopefully that'll help you avoid any mistakes along the way. The first thing that you want to do is choose a really good quality fondant. Yes, there's some out there. So if you'll go to sweetwise.com, you can look at some of the ones that I prefer. There's lots out there to try, and you can make your own as well. That's certainly fine. So for Fondant Survival, I just want to talk about a few of the most common questions that I get about working with fondant. The first thing is going to be elephant skin. And what that comes from is working with a fondant that's a little bit dry, you've added a lot of powder maybe underneath it, and it's also air drying up from the top. So when you go to put it on the cake, it kind of cracks a little bit, and if you look up close it looks like elephant's knee, so that's where the term elephant skin comes from. There's a couple of things that you can do to avoid that. The first thing is making sure that your fondant's moist. If you start with a little bit of a dry fondant, you can moisten it up by adding a little bit of vegetable shortening or white fat, they call it in some countries. That would work. Another thing you can do to keep it from drying out is to avoid how much powder you're using. That's cornstarch, corn flour, powdered sugar, or some kind of combination of those things. So one more thing that you can do is use an item that we have at Sweetwise called the mat. This is actually a two-piece system, and it eliminates all of those problems altogether. Because you're rolling it out on the bottom sheet, you have no powdered sugar, cornstarch, that sort of thing to dry out from the bottom. And then because you have a top sheet covering it, it's also not air drying from the top. So let's go over here and talk a little bit more about air pockets and where they come from. Okay, so here you see a little bit of an air pocket popping out, and what that comes from is it can be several different things. First of all, it might be a little bit of an air pocket that you've trapped in there as far as when you're stacking the cakes, as far as the layers go. If you look back at the torting and filling video, you'll see where I talk about compressing those layers to really get any air that's trapped in there out before you ice the outside. That's first. Second of all, it might be a little bit of temperature differentiation. So if you're working with a cold cake, which I personally like to do, they're way easier to ice and easier to transport. But if you're working with a cold cake and then cover it and then it comes to room temperature, any of that little trapped air bubbles in there, just like a hot air balloon, can expand, and it's got to find a way out. So it's going to try to find a way out the side, maybe between the layers. So let me show you what to do if you have this happening. What I like to do is go ahead and give it a little bit of a chimney. I'm going to use a skewer, not a dowel rod, but a nice thin skewer, and just give it a little bit of a chimney right down the center, and that gives that air pocket a place to go. And if you want to, you can come back with your fondant smoother and just smooth that out, and it's really just going to disappear, and that air pocket's going to go right up the chimney. So another thing that I get asked a lot about is pockmarks in cakes. So these are like little air holes that you see in the surface of the cake, and that can come from a number of different things, but I would suggest that probably the most common thing is how you're kneading it. You're actually trapping some air in there, so you're either trapping it in with your rolling pin or with your kneading. So a lot of times I'll see people almost pulling like taffy their fondant when they're trying to knead it. What I'd rather see you do is not putting so much air into it. If you knead it and just kind of keep it close to your surface and just use the heel of your hand, just like you're kneading bread dough, then you're less likely to knead that air pocket in there and see it in the end result in your cake. So the next question I get asked often is, why is my fondant tearing? And again, that can be a number of reasons why that's happening. It might be because you're being a little bit too aggressive in pulling at it when you're actually adhering it to the cake. Another reason might be you've rolled it too thin in a certain spot, and that's where it's tearing. So I'm just going to hold this up. I've went ahead and over-exaggerated this a little bit. The fondant is thin in one spot, and if I pull aggressively in that spot, then it's going to tear right there where that thin spot is. So you can see I can hold it up to the light while it's on the mat, and I can see straight through it, and I can identify that thin spot, and that way I can go back and correct that. So one more thing I want to talk about on the Fondant Survival section is sagging fondant. I get this question a lot, and it comes from either over kneading your fondant or putting the heat of kneading plus the liquid from the coloring. So this is something to be careful of. If you're coloring the fondant the same day you're using it, you're likely going to have some sagging, kind of like you got some socks that have lost their elastic. So you'll see here where it sags a little bit at the bottom, it gathers. What I would suggest that you do with that is when you're coloring fondant, make sure you do it a couple days ahead of time, wrap it up really tight so that it can come back to room temperature and rest. And then once you go to roll it out and put it on the cake, you're going to have less likelihood of it sagging at the bottom. So thank you for joining me for Fondant Survival. These are, again, some of my uglier cakes, and I hope you had fun with them like I did. If you will take some of these tips that I've given you today, coloring your fondant ahead of time, keeping it moist, watching out for air pockets, those are some of the more common questions I get. I think if you start with that and practice with your fondant a little bit, it's not going to be scary to you. Don't let fondant be scary. Just have fun with it.